I would strongly advocate here is that we get the pH right. There's a big lime requirement on dry stock farms, and lime, it's costing, I don't know, 30-35 euros a ton, you know what I mean, and it'll fix the problem for the next 5 years, and you will grow more grass.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, as thoughts on farms move to fertiliser application, in this second part of the podcast, I'm joined by Teagasc specialist Mark Plunkett with the Signpost programme to discuss fertiliser application and the fertiliser register. Mark, before we begin, can you review 2024 regarding fertiliser usage and particularly chemical nitrogen? How did usage compare to previous years given the introduction of the fertiliser register?
We've seen some recovery. Nitrogen usage increased by 10% in 2024. Now, we had an all-time low in 2023. We'd come down from the highs in 2022 of 343,000 tonnes. And I suppose, look, there's been a lot going on in the whole, especially the fertiliser side of the house, Catherine, in terms of, we've just come out of a fertiliser crisis where, fertiliser prices doubled, and we've seen the impacts of that. As I say, we had the lowest fertiliser usage in 2023 of 280,000 tonnes of nitrogen.
And when you look at the breakdown of nitrogen used on farms, was there more protected urea or more straight nitrogen products used, Mark?
I suppose if you look at the nitrogen market, there's roughly half of the nitrogen come in compounds, as in 18, 6, 12 and 10, 10, 20, and the other half then comes in the straight nitrogens, the likes of your ureas, your protected ureas and your CAN. And I suppose since 2021, we have seen a nice increase in the use of protected urea, as it's a very sustainable and low carbon fertilizer. And in 2024, there was 26% of the straight nitrogen was protected urea. I suppose there is a change happening around nitrogen type here in Ireland. I suppose, like in the last 2 years, we have seen more urea being used, and we had a tipping point in 2024 where over 50% of the straight nitrogen was urea, or protected urea. And as I say, in 2024, 26% of that was protected urea, and the other was ordinary urea. So we are using less can-based nitrogen, in the last 2 years. And I suppose it's been driven, by a number of factors. Price will be one, that urea is about 20% cheaper than can-based nitrogen, so there's a cost savings there for farmers. And I suppose secondly, protected urea is a very sustainable form of nitrogen, and it's probably the most, I suppose, significant technology or on farm in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Like if you take a dairy farm, for example, I know it's mainly dry stock audience we have here in terms of the podcast, but we can reduce total farm emissions by about 8%. And if you take a dry stock farm, that's about 4%. So a very important and a very, very significant technology for Irish farmers in terms of saving money and also reducing on-farm emissions.
And you mentioned there the phosphorus and potassium. In 2024, what levels of those were used?
A lot has happened around the P&K market. Like, you know what I mean? If you look at phosphorus usage there, again, in the last 4 years, we were probably at peak phosphorus usage there in 2021. And, since the fertilizer crisis has hit, we've seen a 38% reduction in the usage of phosphorus on farm. Like, we're not as low as where we were back in 08 or 09, but in 2024 we're at 28,000 tonnes of phosphorus, but a big slippage since 2021. And I suppose very much driven by the fertilizer price crisis in 22 and 23. Like 18, 6, 12 was at a high of 1,000 euros a ton, back in, 22, 23. And look, I very, very expensive. And we've seen a big fall off in the use of 18,612. Its usage has reduced by 40% in the last 2 years, which is quite concerning. And as Tim was saying, will hit soil fertility, which is very, very important on farm. In terms of potassium, again, we have seen a similar decline. We were at a peak in 2021 at about 123,000 tons, and that hit a low of 82,000 tons approximately in 2023. Now we have seen some recovery in the usage of K, which is positive, which is good. But overall, the usage is back, and again, I would try to connect with people on the podcast here today, Catherine, that we go back to spreading P's and K's on farms, especially for grass-based production systems. P and K is very, very important in terms of growing sufficient grass during the growing season.
Tim had mentioned last week, the importance of lime, and many farmers will have applied for the lime grant and applied lime as a result. What's the situation on farms in relation to lime and the pH of the soil?
Yeah, again, if we, there's been a lot of samples taken on dry stock farms in the last 2 years. We're hitting, 42, 43, 44,000 soil samples, which is, a big chunk of the samples, over half of the samples that are coming in through the advisory service. And I suppose up to 2023, soil sample numbers had dropped off dramatically on the dry stock side. But now there is a lot of soil sample information there on farm. And I suppose one of the big things coming out of those results that we would see in the database, Catherine, is that there is still a large requirement for lime on dry stock farms. Like 65% of dry stock farms have a pH less than 6.2. And lime is vital. Like I'd say, one message that I would give to people on the podcast here today is that we need to invest in lime. Lime brings many benefits. You'll grow about 10, 15, 20% more grass. It'll also increase the availability of NP and K. We can unlock 30, 40, 50 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. So there's a free bag of nitrogen there that will be released annually, um, from your soils by getting the pH right. So very, very important that we get lime right. And again, it's a small investment on farm as well.
And that 65% of soils that's deficient in lime, Mark, in addition to all the benefits you mentioned there, what impact is there for applying the current chemical fertiliser to those soils when the lime is already incorrect?
Again, in terms of efficiency, like, you know what I mean? If you have low pH and low P and K, like you're only getting about a 50% efficiency. Sorry, yeah, less. Like if you apply 100 kilos of nitrogen, you're only utilizing 35% of that nitrogen. So 35 kilos is utilized in growing the grass, and the other 65 kilos is lost. And by getting the pH right, you know what I mean? You can go from 35 up to 51% nitrogen use efficiency. And then by building the P and K, you can go to about 65% nitrogen efficiency. So like if the pH is not right, you know what I mean, you will not get the best response. You get a poor response from applied NP and K, both in bag fertilizer and also in your valuable slurries, in your cattle slurry and your farmyard manure. So lime should be a priority. It should be the first investment on dry stock farms, to get that pH right. As I said, you'll grow 10, 15, 20% more grass from just liming alone.
That's a huge potential saving there, Mark, for sure. A lot of farmers are talking about their concern in relation to using Protected Urea last year, and should the concern be more around the product use or the impact there was on growth, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, look, 2024 was a difficult grass growing year. Like if you remember back, February, March, April, May, they were very wet months. Livestock was housed longer than normal. There was difficult grazing conditions, and even when livestock got out, there was a lot of poaching going on. And then if we move into, the midsummer, if we take, June, July, and August, again, the weather was very cool. It was dry. There was Arctic air. Rainfall was below average. It was quite dull. There was little sunshine. Look, it was a very poor year for growing grass. The conditions weren't there, in especially in that June, July, August window, and it hit grass production, dramatically. Like we're talking up to 17% reduction in grass growth. And, it didn't matter what type of nitrogen you spread, the grass didn't grow. The conditions weren't there for it wasn't a good grass growing year. Like dry matter production was back anywhere from a ton to 2 tons of dry matter per hectare. Like,
and for farmers that's going to be buying fertiliser in the coming weeks, Tim highlighted the importance of having the nutrient management plan to decide how much fertiliser they can buy. When should the first application be applied and what should farmers be aware of?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first application, I suppose, look, we're heading into the season now. The days are getting longer. There's more sunshine. Soil temperatures are increasing. Fields are drying out. I suppose I look. I suppose the day length is important. It's probably the key factor in terms of response to nitrogen. Also, soil temperature. So again, we'd like a soil temperature above 5.5 to 6 degrees, and also good ground conditions. So as I say, look, over the coming, I suppose, over the coming weeks, Catherine, it will be time to be, getting fertilizer into the yard. And I suppose that first round, we will be looking something like a urea-based nitrogen, protected urea. And again, we're looking at say 15 to 20 units per acre of nitrogen to go out in that first split. There is not a massive demand. It's not really until we move into say, after Paddy's Day, after mid-March, you know, that's when we get significant um, grass growth. That's when we get a significant requirement for nitrogen. But that early nitrogen slot, as say, we're talking, somewhere around mid-February onwards. And again, as I was saying, something like, 15 to 20 units of a protected urea or slurry. Again, my view on slurry, look, ideally it should be going to the fields where silage is going to be cut. Again, you're talking 2,500 gallons per acre, and that can deliver, sufficient nitrogen for that early slot, that early window, and also it will help replenish and supply valuable P and K for the following silage crop.
And what paddocks should be targeted, Mark, in relation to farmers starting now with the fertiliser? Which paddocks would you be recommending to go first?
Ideally, I suppose it's the drier paddocks, it's the more responsive fields, maybe the fields that have been reseeded more recently, say in the last 2 or 3 years. The fields that have, I suppose, the best soil fertility, have good lime status, have good P's and K's, where you're going to get a good response to nitrogen and also low covers as well, like, you know what I mean? So I suppose those fields, the most responsive fields, I suppose the early fields, let's call them, on the farm, that you're going to see the best response and the best utilization of that nitrogen, whether it's going out as a cattle slurry or in the form of bag fertilizer.
Most definitely. And in relation to compound fertiliser, you mentioned the importance of P and Ks earlier. When is the ideal time to apply P and K if needed?
Yeah, the ideal time, I suppose, Catherine, is when we get into that peak grass growth. Well, not peak grass growth, but when we're climbing, as I say, after Paddy's Day, depending on the soil type, probably the lighter soils will start to respond that little bit earlier than maybe the heavier soils. Maybe you're talking maybe early April to mid-April. But again, it's that second round. That's when we see the best response or the best utilization of the phosphorus, and ideally something like an 18-6-12 with sulfur. Do you know what I mean? That will go out, in the second round or the third round, depending on the soil type. And on dry stock farms, like, probably a bag to the acre or maybe a bag and a half to the acre, depending on your P allowance, will supply sufficient phosphorus. Like, I suppose phosphorus is like Tim was talking about the car with no steering wheel, but if you have a car with no key, you won't be traveling at all. But like the phosphorus is very, very important. It's the kick, it's what starts the engine. It's very important in terms of routing, very important in terms of tillering, and also very important in terms of nitrogen utilization. And we see the best response in that second round, that March, April window. I suppose once you're hitting, 25 to 30 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day. And as I'm saying to you as well, include sulfur. We're seeing very, very good responses to sulfur here in Johnstown Castle. And again, it gets back to nitrogen use efficiency. A little bit of sulfur is very, very important, and it also simplifies the fertilizer program as well, as you can then move to something like a straight protected urea as your main nitrogen source, for the remainder of the season.
And sulfur is often something that's forgotten, Mark, that's very important. What soils in particular is sulfur most important to, and what's the real function of sulfur in it? Because it is available in a lot of different mixes, be it compound fertilizers or straight nitrogen plus sulfur.
I suppose in terms of the function, it's very important there in terms of it has a link with nitrogen uptake, or there's a balance there. You're sort of talking 10:1. So again, it's important to have just enough sulfur there to drive nitrogen use efficiency. In terms of the response on soil type, we are seeing a response anywhere from, on the heavier soils, we're seeing a 10% yield increase. So if you're growing 10 tons of dry matter, getting the sulfur in there, you grow an extra ton, you'll grow 11 tons. And on the light soils, then the likes of your Moor Park or your Oak Park, the lighter soils, like we're seeing a very big yield response. We're seeing up to 40% yield increase. You know what I mean? Um, sulfur is not right. So sulfur very, very important, very, very important for the road that we're on, Catherine, in terms of, with more restrictive limits around nitrogen, that we utilize the nitrogen as efficiently as possible. So sulfur is very, very important there. And again, look, I would be ordering, as I say, if I was getting 18612 or 13620 or whatever the fertilizer blend may be in the morning, I would be getting sulfur in there. And also very important on the silage ground as well, that, where you're putting out your cattle slurry, that you're putting out a nitrogen source, then something like a 38+7. Or depending on what's going to fit, but getting in that 12 or 15 units of sulfur per acre per cut on your silage ground. And on the grazing ground, again, it's 12 or 15 units per year on the grazing ground. But yeah, sulfur, very, very important, especially around nitrogen and, maximizing the utilization of that nitrogen as efficiently as possible.
And I think that's key. You mentioned there, farmers are aware and wondering about the different limits on different things. There's no limit on sulfur, and there's some confusion about the limits to N and P that Tim has covered last week. And then in relation to K that can be used on farm, what limits are there?
I suppose that maybe I'll just caveat that one on the sulfur. Like I say, don't over apply sulfur. Again, 12 to 15 units is loads. In terms of potassium, Catherine, look, on the grazing ground, I'd be an advocate of putting out a maintenance application. So on dry stock farms, you're probably talking maybe 15 to 20 units per acre on dry stock farms. On silage ground, then, again, we're talking, 70 units, sort of max for that first cut of silage. Like in general, 3,000 gallons or even 2,500 gallons of a good quality cattle slurry will supply the majority of the potash, to grow the actual crop. And then you can come back after your cut of silage with build up or additional K, midsummer or into the autumn, and the same would apply on the grazing ground as well.
That's great, Mark. And finally, you've covered a lot there in the last few minutes. For farmers that are going buying fertiliser and going applying fertiliser and slurry in the coming weeks, what are the top 3 tips that you'd have for farmers this spring?
The first thing I would strongly advocate here is that we get the pH right. There's a big lime requirement on dry stock farms, and lime, it's costing, I don't know, 30, 35 euros a ton. You know what I mean? And it'll fix the problem for the next 5 years, and you will grow more grass. The second thing I would say, buy a sustainable fertilizer compound, as in 18612, with sulfur. It tends to be the best value for money, and it's a very sustainable and a very good form of nitrogen in that 18612. And my third message to your listeners here today, Catherine, would be continue with Protected Urea. It's a very important tool or technology for the sector. And again, it's nitrogen. You know what I mean? We had a tricky year in 2024, but that was very much down to the weather conditions. But the science is very strong. It's growing as much grass as a can-based fertilizer, and it's more sustainable. It can reduce emissions by 250% on our farms compared to can. So, them would be my 3 tips for 2025, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Mark. Some great tips and advice there for farmers.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you.
If you missed last week's episode with Teagasc specialist Tim Hyde, who discussed the rules and regulations surrounding nitrates, you can listen back. That's all for this week's episode. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.